The first place I'd ever been where they had garbage police, and I thought, this is ridiculous. Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. I posted a video, or created a video, I guess, the other day talking about the new residency visa options in Singapore. And some people were asking some things about Singapore versus Switzerland and some other places. And so I figured I would do a video for you today discussing Singapore versus Switzerland. What are the pros and cons of each? Which is a better place to live in? And, maybe what it is that may appeal most to you in your situation, because they both have different appeals. So let's dive in. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell. If you're new here, welcome. We help with custom international holistic structuring, strategy, options, forming companies, opening bank accounts, figuring out how to optimize the tax, figuring out what the best place is for you, getting you second citizenships, etc. If you're interested in any of that, please reach out to us. You can book a call with me, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, or send a message through offshorecitizen.net. Okay, so both great countries, right? Singapore and Switzerland, by most metrics, are probably two of the best countries in the world in terms of quality of life, in terms of what they offer, etc. And so it's, I think, fairly reasonable to contrast them. In fact, sometimes Singapore has been considered sort of the Switzerland of the East. Obviously, UAE is trying to be the Switzerland of the Middle East, or the Singapore of the Middle East, kind of going with that model. And I think it's kind of a proven model, right? So let's talk about some of the differences. Now, if we just start with climate, this is probably the most obvious difference. Singapore is hot and humid. And I would argue that for a lot of people, the warmth is nice, but the humidity is off-putting. So that's, pros and cons depending on what you like. Switzerland, on the other hand, it's in the Alps, right? It's a mountainous country, so obviously it's comparatively fairly cold. I was there earlier this spring. I had some videos from Liechtenstein and things like this. You can go back and check those out. And I mean, it's super, super beautiful country. Definitely lots of wild natural beauty, great hiking, and things like this. So if you prefer the outdoors activities, arguably Switzerland is better, but it's also cold. So if you prefer someplace that's warm, well, then Singapore is better. And I think that's an important distinction right off the bat in terms of people's values. I talked to some clients who were relocating, and some of them, prefer to be in some place a little cooler. Some people prefer to be some places a little hotter, and a lot of people prefer places that are hotter but not so humid. So that's number one. Number two, if we talk about cost of living, then we're talking about, Switzerland is broadly considered to be one of the most expensive places in the world. Obviously, it depends what you're buying and things like that, but Singapore is also considered to be one of the most expensive cities by kind of expat global relocation surveys. Now, there's some pushback on just how expensive Singapore is compared to some of these other places, because it depends on whether you're doing kind of more traditional Asian cuisine, etc., versus are you buying steak. If you try to take on Western values in Singapore, then the cost of living will be higher than if you're going for traditional Eastern values in Singapore. But overall, I would say both are quite expensive places to live. It's really, really marginal, the differences, in my view. It really depends on what it is that you're after specifically. Certainly, if you're looking for a house, then you have more ability to have houses in Switzerland, whereas you're more or less confined, I would say. There are definitely houses in Singapore, but not in the same way that you're going to get where you can have nice yards and things like that, or what's called larger yards, etc. In Singapore, that's just not such a big thing. But on the other hand, you can get really nice apartments, right? So, do you prefer apartment living? Do you prefer that sort of thing, or do you prefer houses? Either way, the costs are going to be high in both countries. All right. Next, let's talk a little bit about the banking. So both fantastic banking places. So once again, we run into this situation where often I tell people that these are, arguably two of the most top world-class places for banking. And so, again, very neck to neck. I tend to lean a little bit towards Singapore. I just find it's a little bit easier to get things done there. However, Switzerland definitely has top-tier options. There are a lot more options in Switzerland, and so that could be a factor for you, whether you're playing it out as well either. What else can we think about? Well, now we can talk about the overall how the system functions, right? So if we look at how the system functions, again, what do we got? Things like infrastructure, so they're both super clean, they're both super safe. Healthcare is great in both of them. The education is great in both of them. So you've got like very much world-class standards in all these regards. I would say that for me personally, it's interesting because they both have their own set of rules in their own ways, right? So if you're like a freedom of speech advocate, well, you're probably going to be more towards Switzerland than you are towards Singapore. On the other hand, I remember Switzerland years ago was the first place I'd ever been where they had garbage police, and I thought, this is ridiculous. So I don't know, for me, it depends on what your values are, but like for example, you know, you're gonna have a real problem with drugs in Singapore. Not to say that you're gonna have an amazing time with drugs in Switzerland, but certainly, you know, people who are weed smokers or something like that, you know, stay away from Singapore. That's not the place for you. They're definitely very efficient in executing justice in Singapore, and that's a factor that I think actually contributes to how good things are. But on the other hand, some people may prefer not to have that. So both pretty ruley, even though I would say that in terms of, how would I describe it to you? I think in terms of social rules, it's probably more constricted in a certain way in Singapore. But in terms of kind of their enforcement of, like for example, the tax department's much more likely to come and do an inspection and call you up because, you know, how can you survive just living off investments sort of thing. So that's a bit of it's a personal preference in terms of which side you prefer. And again, like we're across the line here, we're comparing two countries that are both really good, but they have differences. Let's talk about passports and immigration. So I mentioned finally they're bringing some new policies that make it easier for the right types of people. Obviously, in the video I was mentioning 30,000 Singapore dollars per month in terms of income. For a lot of people, that's a high threshold. For some people, it's perfectly fine. I think, you know, for a lot of the people who I deal with, I would kind of look at it as this is a cheap way to expedite. If you can just pay yourself a $30,000 a month salary and get in, fantastic. I mean, it's money that's going to you, etc. But some people's businesses don't support that, or they don't have a job that supports it, etc. So that would be an issue for them. So that's a drawback if you're kind of below that threshold. Whereas I know a lot of people, we employ a lot of people in Eastern Europe, and a lot of people are very interested in moving to Switzerland to take advantage of job opportunities, etc. So for those types of people, it's probably favorable to relocate to Switzerland over Singapore. On the other hand, if you're looking at this from the passport standpoint, although they're both really excellent passports, I would argue that the Swiss passport is better, probably by a reasonable degree, than the Singapore passport. Now, in terms of absolute travel locations, it's not. Singapore is actually a slightly better passport in terms of the amount of raw travel you get. But Switzerland is a Schengen country. It's not EU, but it's Schengen, which is kind of an interesting thing. So you have a lot of access and movement in that area. Number two, you're in a situation where they allow dual citizenship, and Singapore doesn't. So this is like one of the major blows. The key thing that I consider as a disadvantage to the Singapore passport is that it's not available, or that you can't have dual citizenship. It really kind of knocks it off the list of desirable citizenships to me. Now, the other thing that goes along with that is the path to citizenship, I would argue, is a little clearer in Switzerland. What do I mean by this? On paper, the path to citizenship in Singapore is fairly clear. In practice, it's actually quite difficult to get, and what they say on paper, it will be quite a bit longer for you to get it than it appears. So the reality and the paper kind of disagree in that regard. So again, I would say Switzerland, probably a better place to go if you're thinking about long-term planning towards citizenship and a passport. So that's another factor. What else have we got here? We've got taxes. When it comes to taxes, for most people, I would argue that Singapore is definitively better than Switzerland. Let's just talk about what that is. So in Singapore, yes, technically the top tax bracket was 22% and going up to 24%. However, realistically, you should never pay more than 17% for most people because that's the corporate tax rate and there's no tax on dividends. So top tax rate of 17% I think is extremely reasonable, especially for what you're getting. Some people were kind of mentioning in the comments, oh, it's not zero tax. And it may surprise people, but I'm not like a totally anti-tax person. But I do care a lot about what you're getting for your money. And I think in Switzerland, or sorry, in Singapore, you're really getting a lot of value for your money. I'm perfectly happy to contribute 17% to a country that functions as well as Singapore does. So that's good. On top of this, they have no capital gains, so that's a big deal. Somebody who's only earning money through capital gains would never have to pay taxes. There's no CFC rules, which helps if you have foreign companies. There's ways if you're doing international tax planning for companies, etc. Realistically, you can get your tax down to 3 to 5%. So that's really, really optimal from a Singapore standpoint. Switzerland is not nearly so favorable. So a few different things to note here. Number one, Switzerland has a wealth tax, and that can be quite annoying, right? So especially if you look at some of the double tax treaties. So for example, I've had clients who are American who are living in Switzerland, and the problem is that the US will normally give you a tax credit for the taxes paid in the other country, but because there's no equivalent tax to the wealth tax, you can't get that credited back in the US. So this becomes an issue. Generally speaking, the tax rates vary quite a bit around the country depending on which canton you're in. There's like 34 cantons in Switzerland, so lots of different places to choose from. And the thing is that even in the lowest standpoint, it's not usually going to be as low as what you're getting in Singapore. Now, you can have what I would call reasonable taxes, and again, for the quality of life you're getting, for all the stuff that's going along with it, that could be perfectly worth it if I compare it to most Western countries, like I was compared to Scandinavia or Germany, France, places like that. Certainly it's much better, right? It's a big improvement. But it's definitely not fantastic in this regard. So that's a factor, and they have CFC rules. It's very difficult to do international tax planning. Like, they're really on the ball when it comes to Switzerland. So Switzerland's tax rules will tend to be well imposed, I would say. This is the main place where Singapore, to me, has a clear lead. It's not just values-based, right? A lot of these are values-based. You're like, okay, well, do I have this, or do I like hot, or do I like cold? Do I like humid, or do I like non-humid? Do I like nature, or do I like city? You can kind of go down, and that's a values decision, right? There's no clear answer there. But on this one, there's a clear, definitive answer. I guess the passport thing would be, clearly, definitively in the faint for Switzerland. This comes to the next part, which is, do you like cities or do you like rural? Certainly, Singapore is a world-class city, about 5 million people, has pretty much all the conveniences you would look for. By contrast, the biggest city in Switzerland, Zurich, is dramatically smaller. There are no really big cities in Switzerland, and so if that's what you're after, I mean, it's a more small city or rural environment. And so, the real place where it shines is in the nature, whereas the real place that shines for Singapore is being cosmopolitan. Although granted, I would say it's only fairly recently they've started to bring a lot of cultural things in. And so Singapore is there's an expression I think I've mentioned in some other videos. You do business in Singapore, live in KL, and party in Bangkok. So, you have that. And that, I think, brings us to what may be the final point for you to consider, which is just what part of the world do you like? The nice thing about Switzerland is it's super well connected in Europe. So you can jump on a flight and you can be all over the place in 1 or 2 hours, right? That's great. You can get access to, Italy, Spain, France, UK, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, Greece. Like, all these places are very much within a very short flight. So that's great. They are also all Europe. So the question is the European culture the one that you like? I mean, lots to love about European culture. So, no real complaints there. On this flip side, Singapore has the same sort of thing in Southeast Asia. So if you want to be able to hop on a flight and be in Bali, be in Thailand, be in Philippines, be in Vietnam, be in Hong Kong is not that far, Malaysia, Maldives, like, a lot of these things are very close and accessible from Singapore. So I think there's a big question of just what do you like in that regard, and this is probably a significant trade-off. If you like driving cars, it's really bad to drive cars in Singapore. They have something called Certificate of Entitlement, which basically the car costs you like 4 times more than it would normally cost. So, if somebody wants to buy a Lamborghini, it's normally 500 grand. Now it's probably 2 million. In Singapore, so that's not so great. On the other hand, you have great public transit, and it's well connected in that regard. I was in Switzerland and we got stuck in weekend traffic, and it was just hours of sitting there waiting. It was terrible. So a little bit of a different experience depending on what it is that you would like. So anyway, I think they're both amazing places. Oh, the one thing I should mention, because some people will probably ask about it, there is a flat tax regime that they've had traditionally in Switzerland to attract people. Honestly, this scheme is not as straightforward and not as simple and clear cut as a bunch of people might believe. And so, yes, you can do that to get tax optimization, but your income needs to be pretty darn high in order to make it worthwhile. And by contrast, there is something called a single family office structure in Singapore. Now it's for people who have 50 million plus that they can put in there. And that's a great structure as well. So, I would say for most people, if you're just looking from a financial standpoint, Singapore is going to be better, plus you have good quality of life, plus. But, people who prefer to be in Europe, prefer to be working towards a Swiss passport, etc., Switzerland's a great option as well. It's also, I would say, arguably quite a bit easier for certain types of people to immigrate into Switzerland and find opportunities than it is in Singapore. So Singapore's great. I would argue you've already been making money, whereas you can go and make money. Although, to be fair, there's lots of job opportunities and lots of industry, and it's a fast-moving place in Singapore. One last thing I keep having to add here. Doing business in Singapore is dramatically easier than doing business in Switzerland. So setting up Swiss companies is expensive, it's slow, it's a pain in the ass. Don't recommend it in most situations. Whereas the opposite is typically true in Singapore. Singapore is easy to do business. It's really, really optimized in that regard. And so somebody was commenting, they're like, oh, it's, what did they say? They called it a socialist dictatorship or something. There's nothing socialist at all about Singapore. Singapore functions really, really well, really smoothly, very free market, very like that. Certainly, yes, the government it's kind of a weird sort of mix of democracy, but not really democracy. So, again, personal preferences on that one. But definitely ease of business is far, far, far better in Singapore than it is in Switzerland. So tell me what you guys like. Put them in the comments below. And I look forward to seeing you on the next video.